physical processes. Today is about whether or not we can actually do anything about it. And there's a famous story about a lecturer who destroyed his computer when it wouldn't work. There we go. And let's jump to slide. There we go. What will it take? Okay, so yesterday we said, all right, it's happening, it's our fault, so what are we going to do? The Earth is heating up. It's causing some impacts, and we'll talk a little bit more about the impacts tomorrow, in fact. But today we're going to see, is there anything we can do to stop it? Now, there's a famous story about King Canute, or Knut, as you said. He ruled England for 19 years. He conquered the country in 1016. He was king of Denmark, king of Norway. People thought he was a very capable ruler. In fact, his subjects loved him so much that when he wanted to share his power and diminish his power because they just thought he was amazing, they said no. They said, you are all powerful. And they took him down to the beach and they put him in a chair at the beach, and you might know the story. And they said to him, okay, even the tide will obey you. If you command the tide not to come in, it will obey you, you see. And then the foolish masses, they always are foolish masses. That's why people like some presidents, I'm not allowed to mention names, I got into trouble yesterday, but they supported him. They thought he could do that. And the net result was that he could do nothing about that, as you know. The tide came in and washed around him, and the lesson was to his people, I'm not all powerful. There's certain things that I can't handle. So we can't just thrust this problem into the hands of other people and say they must solve it. We have to put responsibility where responsibility lies, and ultimately in our country, responsibility lies with our president. And this is what he said at SONA 2019. We will await very, very interesting to hear what he's going to say in SONA 2020, because we've had a lot of electricity issues, and our electricity issues and our coal issues are intertwined. And I'm starting there, and I'm going to end there today. However, reducing emissions. Yesterday we spoke about these three components of carbon dioxide emissions, or carbon dioxide equivalents as we call them, because I mentioned to you that agriculture, livestock is not carbon dioxide, it's methane. And if we look at the contribution, or South Africa's contribution for those three, you'll see that by far the most is in energy. So when we talk in an African context, very much in an African context, and we consider the problems of too little energy in many African countries, too little meat or protein in many African countries, and very small-scale agriculture, you can see that by tackling energy is probably the most efficient one. If South Africa can tackle the energy, and other countries to whom we export very often, and to whom our technologies can be exported, if we can tackle that there, then we'll put Africa in a much better place. So the focus today is going to be on energy and much less on these, okay? Because it doesn't make much sense in the South African context. So the one thing to consider, and if you read The Silent Spring, which was a book that came out in the early 70s, and was really the start of an environmentalist movement, and if you saw that picture of the Earth rising from the moon, and you've become environmentally aware, you will have heard of the word externality, which is something that is not normally taken into account in our economic processes. So you will see when we do mining for coal. Now, coal is a fantastic thing. I mean, let's face it. You pick up this piece of stone, it's black, it leaves some marks on your fingers, but then you put it into a source of ignition, and it burns for 45 minutes and gives out a whole lot of heat. It's a fuel. It's fantastic. And the same for oil. I mean, you can take a beaker full of petrol and you can move a 1-ton truck from here to there. I mean, you could never lift that yourself. It'd take you 50 people to do that. So it's an amazing resource. But we must understand that traditionally all we've said is, well, you mine it, you burn it, and you consume electricity. Simple, straightforward. But there are things called externalities. Okay, so the mining companies and the coal companies pay for these. They pay for the fuel, they pay for the operations, they pay for the labor and the whole machinery putting it together. And we pay for the electricity, but we also pay for the health impacts, the environmental degradation, and, of course, subsidies. Not every coal mine is subsidized, but the point is there are externalities here. And if you include those externalities, which is difficult, it's not easy. Because what do you put a price? How do you put a price on clean air? So some people, environmental economists, have spent years saying, well, you calculate all the diseases and the cost of treating those diseases from the impure air, and that's the cost of clean air. That's the price you should be prepared to pay to clean air, or that's the price the polluter should pay. So it's a complicated thing. Now, more and more people are saying, well, hang on a second. This is not right. We need to include those externalities into the price of coal. And suddenly coal doesn't become cheap anymore. 75% of coal production is more expensive than renewables, with industry outcompeted on cost by 2025. We'll talk about that in more detail. So the problem is we persist, and we're building coal-fired power stations right now all over the world that by the time we get to 2030 are going to be so much more expensive. This is the sort of price percentage of operating under construction coal capacity with higher long-run operating cost. Okay, so by 2030, 89% of our coal-fired power stations will be more expensive than an alternative. So why invest in that? And you can see America's way up there. Russia, not so much. They've got alternatives. Philippines, picking on some countries, but you can see the usual suspects, if you like, are up there. So we persist with this idea. And yet, the economists are saying renewables are the cheapest form of new energy generation available. They're quicker to construct, obvious answer to ensure new generation capacity, including the direct cost and the environmental cost and the indirect costs of load shedding. It is an absolute no-brainer to build renewables. So, yesterday I showed you this graph. We come to a certain point where we've understood the detection, the prediction. We've even created some uncertainty. You can see we don't exactly know where the future is going to go. Depends on our actions. So now we look at policy, behavior, and technology. And South African government, to their credit, had a look at this policy and decided to do something about it. The economic costs of climate change are there. They're obvious. And they've done some calculations. Okay? They found to be higher than previously thought. A degree of warming would lead to the equivalent of a 0 to 3% permanent loss of GDP. When you talk GDP, people like you and I go, well, makes no difference. When you talk to governments and economists, very, very important. I don't think it's a good indicator of our civilized world, if you like, but that's another story. With a 5 to 10% increase in global temperature, it's economic collapse. Now, hopefully we'll never get to this. Other considerations could lead to losses as high as the equivalent of 20% because these abrupt changes, these disasters that could happen would lead to that. Sorry, jumped a slide. Developing countries are most vulnerable. This is a moral question now. If your developing country needs to jumpstart its economy and you start turning around to a developing country and you say, no, you're not going to be allowed to have any emissions now, they're going to turn around and say, well, excuse me, how did you get to where you are? I mean, that dreaded word colonialism comes up, but it's not even about that. It's about why can't we use the technologies that you used and stuffed up the world? And the answer is, well, maybe it's better to jumpstart those dirty technologies and use cleaner technologies. But there are all sorts of uncertainties, okay? What is the discount rate to the future? These are economic questions. How do you rate $1 in a rich country versus $1 in a poor country? Questions. So lots of things. Did you look at the current generation or the future generation? Are you taking the future generation's interests and economic costs into account? Complicated things, I'm not going to go into that. But if you're an economist or if you're into sort of finances, you can have a long discussion about that. And then, of course, we talk about equity and justice. Is it fair? And here's a question I'll pose to you. People say, as mentioned to you yesterday, they say that population growth is the biggest problem. And I know that in countries in Africa like Uganda, fertility rate of around 6.5. Average Ugandan mother has 6 children. And I've chatted to some Ugandan people, educated people, and they say that's the way we do it. That's our way of life. We like to have big families. So people often point out that that's why we have so many poor people. But if you look at it, an American child, on average, uses 16 times more than the global average of energy in their life. 16 times. So if we're looking at resources, I'd say, not just energy, we're looking at resource use and the lack of resources, we should be telling Americans not to have children. But that's quite a difficult and ethical consideration, as you can imagine. Right, so what does mitigation mean? Well, essentially, reduction of carbon dioxide. We need to reduce our dependence on oil and coal. We need to protect forests. We need to rebuild forests when they've been destroyed. Now, forests are not a magical answer. Once a forest has reached full growth, it in fact starts to absorb slightly less carbon dioxide. So growing forests, active forests, which kind of blows that whole theory out the window of don't print this piece of paper because we want to protect our forests. As in many cases, an active system, an active ecosystem is much more effective than a static one. Livestock emissions. Now you can look at reducing the emissions or you can look at reducing the livestock. I firmly believe we have to reduce livestock, or at least shift them around the globe to where they're more needed. In other words, places that don't have enough protein. We need to look at transport. Everyone has a responsibility, even Africa. Question mark. Should we be looking at developing countries like Africa? And then the bottom line is that many economists and many humanitarians and politicians will say, well, poverty reduction is the key. But can we reduce poverty and or without increasing carbon emissions? That's the question. So the costs of mitigation. The costs of mitigation are small compared to the economic and social consequences. Given a target of 550, now that is way more than we should be aiming at. But this is what the economists have projected. Just given a target of that, well-designed global mitigation will range between a 1% saving and 3.5% cost of GDP with a mean of 1%. Now, defense spending in the world, okay, is more than that. That's just putting it in perspective, a lot more than that. But there are no single silver bullets. So what did the South African government do? Well, first of all, most governments have realized that climate change costs. And I've been giving a similar talk like this since 2010, and you can see it just every year, it just gets worse and worse and worse, and there are lots of examples. Billions and billions of rands of natural disasters. Now, natural disasters are natural, and we can't point to a single natural disaster and say that's climate change. But if natural disasters are increasing, they might be increasing because of the climate, but the value of the damage might be increasing because of the increased population. So also quite complicated. So one of the key effects of climate change is an increased natural disasters, the scale, and normal will soon be what we once thought was extreme when it comes to weather, and this is very, very expensive. So the South African government put together a team called, well, never mind what the team's called, the process was called the long-term mitigation scenario. And they built a team and they had a mandate, a cabinet-mandated process for identifying scenarios for mitigation of climate change. I should stand here, then I can talk to you. So there are two sets of outputs. Robust, broadly supported recommendations for a long-term national policy and a sound basis for negotiating. If we're going to go to COP, we must know what our capabilities are, what our strategy is. Follow up with awareness and implementation so that people know why we're doing this. And that's very often where we fall down. So there's the scenario building team. You can see there were constituents from government, business, and civil society. It was in fact managed by the ERC at UCT, and they worked for about 2 years. And they presented 2 scenarios by this SBT, scenario building team, to frame the choices for South Africa. So the first scenario is growth without constraints. Well, South Africa is just going to say, we don't care, we're just going to use our coal and our fossil fuels, and we're just going to grow because we need to get people out of poverty. And then there was the required by science, what science requires for us to reduce our emissions. So that's the required by science curve. When it comes to carbon emissions, we need to reduce them. That's the decision that the IPCC has made, that the scenario builders have made, said so countries like South Africa need to reduce their emissions. Growth without constraints would lead to something that looks like this. So there's a problem. What's our actual development path? Do I need to press this again? Yes, is something like that. So you can see that a massive change is required. And we call this the gap. How do we reduce our emissions effectively without affecting growth? Tricky. So the robustness of these 2 scenarios. The first one of the growth without constraints, the scientists and the scenario building team, not going to happen. We cannot have that scenario. We're not even going to consider that scenario. It's just not going to work. So the second scenario is required by science. 4 possible strategic options. 4 possible strategic options. What are they? International climate consensus. That one, high hopes. That's what the IPCC is about. That's what COP was all about. COP Paris, the agreements. And now we see governments pulling out of that. So that's a very scary one, that one. International flows of appropriate technology and finance. That is happening. You can invest now your pension fund into a fund that has no money in fossil fuels. You can do that. Okay, I've got a friend who in fact runs such a brokerage. Peak oil arrives. Peak oil is a situation where all the oil production in the world has now peaked, and we can continue using that oil, but we can't use anymore. Unfortunately, we haven't reached peak oil. Oil hasn't become scarce. It's only become expensive because of political situations, because they discovered this thing called fracking, okay, which basically means blowing up areas underground to release trapped gas. Now, it's desperate. It's desperate, but it's effective. If you fly over the United States now, and I had this privilege about 4 or 5 years ago, and now it must be worse, you can fly over some states where you see literally thousands of little wells all over the Midwest. And there's nothing there except these wells. Who knows where they get the water from? High degree of trade integration and globalization, that has happened. Okay, so 2 out of 4, not bad. The technical options, remember the previous ones were strategic, the technical ones are what can technology do to solve the problem. So we had this idea, or they had this idea of wedges, which are individual mitigation actions showing emission reductions and costs. So wedges refer to triangles, and this is the triangle. So there's your emission reduction. That's where you'd like to go. So if that is your trajectory, by doing something very small there and reducing it at this point, this is time, the long term, you'd end up with quite a substantial difference. It's the difference between 1% growth and 3% growth on your pension. This year, it does nothing. In 5 years' time, there's a big difference. So it's cumulative. So this is what we call a wedge. So one activity here can lead to a difference. And if you have a lot of activities, you could maybe reduce that wedge. The scenario building team considered individual mitigation actions. The wedges are modeled, reported, refined, and extended forward in time. Range of actions from realistic to ambitious, but all are conceivable. So not all of these are practical. Now there's a complicated diagram. Okay, we start on the right-hand side. These are what we call small wedges. So you can see the axis on the graph is 0 to 10 tons of carbon dioxide. So there are all sorts of things. Synthetic fuels, manure management, using aluminium instead of steel, enteric fermentation, reduced tillage, afforestation, synthetic fuels using carbon capture and storage, coal mine methane capture. So those tiny wedges are all equivalent to one of the medium wedges, and these go 0 to 50. So if you add all those up, there's 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, and it's similar to this sort of scale, and you can see here are various actions. For example, passenger modal shift. That means getting people to move out of cars and go by train. That'd be nice. Trains. That's an innovative concept. Hey, maybe we should get some for Cape Town. Waste management, biofuels, electric vehicles, solar water heating subsidies. Look at that. You see, it's a medium kind of thing. You replace everyone's heater in South Africa, hot water cylinder, with a solar water heater. It's not a big wedge, but these big, small, medium wedges, then combine to work with the big players. Escalating carbon dioxide tax. Tax people for producing carbon dioxide. Massive saving. Nuclear, electric vehicles, extended renewables, improved vehicle efficiency, subsidies for renewables, renewables. Nuclear rears its ugly head. These are practical things that have a big impact. Okay, so this is laying it all out. Laying it all out. Strategic options. 4 packages of actions to get from growth without constraints towards the goal. What are these packages? Well, growth without constraints is there. The first package is start now. Don't wait. Don't wait. Start with these things now. Let's look at passenger modal shift, improved vehicle efficiency, industrial efficiency. Nuclear's in there. Let's not rather talk about that. Because some people will tell you it's going to destroy us economically if we go nuclear. But it must be in the consideration. So start now is one option. Second option, start now, but scale up in the future. In other words, extend these things. Get even more excited about those things. And you can see this gap is coming down. What's the next one? Use the market. Okay, use the market to encourage people to use less carbon dioxide. So what we're saying is that renewable energy should be cheaper than coal. So that investors don't come and say, well, we'll put up a coal-fired power station. Why would you do that when it's going to cost you more? It's quite straightforward. Now, using the market is only possible if the market is allowed to act independently of government. And in this country, coal-fired power stations are supported by the government. So that's a problem. So there are various options facing the government, okay? And they need to realize this. I think there we go. New technology, identify resources, people-oriented measures. In this case, we can transition to a low-carbon economy. That's the dream. That's the ideal. The costs, most of the costs are savings. If you look at the current zero, that would be no cost whatsoever. The low-hanging fruit, if you like, the simple ones, there we go. There are the different ones. These ones will actually save you money. Okay, so the mitigation costs are a profit. These ones, you start to spend money. But ultimately, if you can keep the cost, and we go right up to electric vehicles in a grid, in other words, you can drive around all over town and just plug in, just plug in, just plug in, plug in. It's going to cost money. Okay, but if you can get this up to 1% threshold, maximum 1% of our GDP, we can reduce our carbon emissions right down to that's what's required by science. Do you think this is going to happen? Well, wait and see, I suppose, but remember that one of those things was start now. Right, what needs to be done? What are the next steps? Next steps for South Africa. Energy efficiency in industry. Can we do that? I'm sure you all know somebody who's doing something about their energy efficiency. We all know that in our houses, not just because of load shedding, but also because electricity is now expensive. When you and I were kids, electricity was cheap. We used to brag about how cheap electricity was. It was one of our problems. We had cheap electricity. We need to start thinking about getting away from filthy, dirty coal. We have got the most fantastic technology that allows us to burn the dirtiest coal in the world. I think the figure that I was told was 47% carbon this coal has got. Okay, it's very, very dirty. Lots of sulfur, lots of other stuff in it that pollutes the atmosphere. Carbon capture and storage. That means when you are releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, is there some way that you can actually capture that carbon dioxide, store it somewhere? Now, it's a gas, remember. So you either have to change it into a solid, very, very tricky, or else absorb it into something and keep it trapped. Okay, so that's something they're working on, maybe reacting it with something and trapping it into a compound. Transport. That's the fastest growing sector of our economy. You can just see that. Look at the traffic every day. I think cars are fantastic things. I was standing in a building the other day looking down onto the roads. And you just see these ants everywhere, all on a mission, all doing something, all involved in economic activity, all moving goods and services around. How can you say don't do that anymore? We've got to think about it. So moving those vehicles to a more efficient state, not taking them all off the road. That would be great when you and I are on the road. There's traffic. Remember, we are the traffic. Remember next time you're in the traffic? You are the traffic. So looking at something to make transport more efficient. And then people-oriented measures like emerging technologies, resource transition to low economy. Of course, at the back of our mind, we're saying if we don't do anything, it's going to cost us. That should be motivating us. Now, it's very, very hard because when a hurricane destroys Beira in Mozambique, hurricane destroys the city, who pays to fix that? Not the people who caused global warming. And that's very, very tricky to understand that. All right, so then there's a question about nuclear renewables. It's a very, very interesting debate. Bishop Javies is a very good friend of mine. He says, none whatsoever. And those whatsoever. He's very, very strong about that. He reckons nuclear is firstly unsafe, secondly so expensive that we cannot possibly afford it. There was a technology called the pebble bed reactors that South Africa developed, and it was a brilliant technology from a technological point of view. May have been a solution, but we sold it because we decided to go big nuclear. And we all know what happened with that. So there's one argument. There's another argument. Sorry, this slide is not supposed to overlap. But renewable off, nuclear on was the viewpoint from the government. And that was in the Zuma era. Am I allowed to mention that name? Bad language. And we're not sure what's happening now. That's been put on hold. But nuclear is still a very good possibility. Now, I'd like to say a show of hands. Someone said to me, how interactive are you in your lecturing? And I said, not much. But yesterday I did ask you to put your hands up, and there were some of you who refused. But how many of you think that nuclear is a realistic option for South Africa? Okay, how many of you think absolutely no ways? Okay, so at 2:15 we'll be meeting in the hall, and there's going to be a massive fight. But the nuclears were slightly more than the non-nuclears. How many of you are completely unsure? Okay, so there's almost equal numbers there. So that's an interesting debate that we have to have. Okay, I personally, my only major problem with nuclear, and I'm a scientist, I mean, I studied physics and I did all the exciting things at varsity. My major problem with nuclear is that you are sitting with waste on site that is never going to go anywhere. It stays there. Now, maybe two things can happen. First of all, we can go to hydrogen fusion. Fusion will be wonderful. Okay, this is no radioactivity escapes, no bad stuff. It's all good stuff. Now that's been tried. We've been trying that for many years. And the other one is to maybe treat that waste or use a different radioactive source so that waste is not quite as harmful. Maybe the technology is there. So I'm cautious to say we shouldn't even be doing research on that because I think we should. Right, that's all I'm going to say about that. When we look at independent power producers, you've all heard of IPP, you've heard of the government speaking to IPPs. Essentially, if I produce my own power, can I sell it to someone who needs it? Eskom, government, the guy down the road, my neighbor, can I sell it? And the government has said, well, hold the phone. It's like your rainwater tank. The city says, no, you can't connect your rainwater tank to the main supply. Because what happens if you turn the tap on and there is no main supply and your rainwater goes into the system and kills the person next door because you've got some bacteria there? So clearly there have to be guidelines. So you can't just add it. So the government has said, essentially, you and your house, doesn't matter how much electricity you make, unless you manage to get your meter to go backwards, which happens in rare occasions if you still have a meter, we are not going to be paying for your electricity. Okay, we are just not going to be paying for it. So I'll just switch this off. So the government has said, though, that if you want to build a power station or some sort of power generation unit, they would be interested. And so they've set various processes in place. And as you can see, between 2018, when there were only about 15 independent, and these were all run by Eskom, sorry, these are Eskom power stations, beg your pardon, and Eskom alternative energy as well. Some of these are wind turbines. So these are Eskom power stations and alternatives. Now we're looking at a map like that with a lot of independent players. So they have put up wind turbines, they have put up solar generators, and they've said to the government, okay, we're investing in this on the basis that at some point in the future, you're going to buy that electricity from us or allow us to sell it to a municipality. So you go to Uppington, there's a big solar tower there, and it's concentrated solar energy, and it heats up water, and that runs a generator, and Uppington benefits from that. Then Uppington and Eskom have a big fight, and then Eskom says, no, 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 you're not allowed to do that. And then there's things that there's a white elephant. So there's some problems. This is essentially how the agreement should look, all right, where the government negotiates with Eskom, Eskom has agreements with IPPs, and the government says, yes, it's allowed, or yes, it's not, no, it's not allowed. And during the last 10 years or so, there have been various points which the government has said, okay, so you want to sell us electricity, you bid. How much do you want? And they put out bids. And those bid prices have come down dramatically. There's been a 209.4 billion rand investment. Negotiated prices keep reducing. Many may reduce them back. So let me just go back a step. So negotiated prices for adding this. So negotiated a price, and initially it was much more than Eskom was paying to make their own. But then Eskom didn't have to worry about the capital, they didn't have to worry about the maintenance, they didn't have to worry about the pollution, they didn't have to worry about pointing fingers, people pointing fingers, and they didn't have to worry about reliability. They said, you must supply us with this and we'll pay you this much. And the price was at a premium. Since then, more and more players have come in and said, well, we don't need to get that much money, we can do it for less. And less, and less, and I'll show those figures. So those bidding prices keep reducing. Now, the motivation for you and as an individual who wants to invest in a power plant for your house, and you're saying, well, hang on a second, electricity is now so cheap, why must I invest in this? Maybe I shouldn't be a producer, maybe I should be a user. And there's a school of thought now that's saying, you know about putting things on top of your house? That's like employing a private security firm. Maybe it's not my responsibility. Maybe we should be pooling our resources that's done on a large scale, reduces the dependence on coal, and we all benefit from that. So there's some debate going on about that. What we should be able to do is to select who we get our power from. They do that in other countries, not developed countries naturally, but you can say, I want to get my power from a gas company or a solar company or a wind power company or the coal company, depending on your beliefs or depending on your affiliations. So solar and wind are two of the big options for South Africa. Can you guess why? We have both in bucketfuls. So these are the comparative prices. Solar power photovoltaic, 79 cents per kilowatt hour. How much are we paying now per kilowatt hour? Well, Medupi costs R1.30 for an operation, but the tariff's going to be around R1.70 into 5-10 years, while wind is only 66, and by 2030, a short 10 years' time, look at those prices. That's really, really cheap. Now, what's nice about that is a measure of our economic growth can be related to the amount of electricity we use. Electricity is a good thing. Can you imagine trying to live without it? Now, you might say, oh, yeah, but it's very romantic having candles and whatever, but try and tell that to someone who lives in a place where they do not have a plug in the wall. That's a different story. The long-term scenario for us is if, based on these prices, this is where our electricity generation future looks. And this gray is coal. Peaking is those peak hour things like pump storage and gas turbines. And you can see that a lot of this is now converted into wind, solar power, and natural gas, so that coal becomes a very, very small part of our economy in terms of electricity generation. That is good news, if it's based on cost alone. And this is the consequence of that in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions. Now, that's the best news I've got in these 3 days. So I'll just leave that slide on for another 5 seconds. What's this deal with wet coal? Huh? As one guy said, I can help you. Build a roof. It's not about the wet coal. It's the fact that somebody is selling Eskom that is powdered coal and not coral coal. You know the difference. What's the English word for coral? Grains. It's powder, and the powder just absorbs and forms a slush. Now, you try and convey a slush. It doesn't work, and it blocks everything up. So it's not the rain. Okay? But what happens if the rain changes? Now, we spoke about the impacts of climate change. I didn't even mention the polar bear. But the impacts I spoke about yesterday include heavier rainfall. And today, if you listen to the Cape Talk News at 12 o'clock, because you wouldn't have listened to it at 1 o'clock because you were hoofing it over here, what did they say? They said Eskom has released a statement to say that the heavy rainfall in Mpumalanga and Natal is causing problems for power generation. Okay, and that's one of the things causing climate change is leading to. So, how are we doing for time? We've still got lots of time. So I'm going to end a little earlier today, but we're going to have some time for discussion. Combating climate change. You as a citizen, what should you be doing? No, you cannot put up a turbine in your backyard. You just can't. You can put some solar panels up, but there are certain guidelines. make sure, how do you do this? How do you use less coal? Come on, how do you use less coal? Use less electricity. Kind of think to yourself, I don't want to do that. I mean, you can buy a smaller car to use less petrol, but how do you use less electricity? Well, you can. More efficient washing machines, more efficient fridges, more efficient use of your electricity. You know, the simple thing of not boiling your kettle when it's full. And your kettle is a demon in your house. Did you know that? Your kettle is a demon. 2 kilowatts. It's very heavy. It's one of the heaviest users of electricity. It's like a hot water cylinder. There's nothing more in your house. Maybe your oven, if you leave that on, but who uses an oven anymore? Photovoltaic panels are an option. Wind generators are an option. Biogas digesters, building design, not really for your average household. If you've ever had a biogas digester, it's very nice in theory, but you need a lot of poo. And one house isn't going to cut it. So in an institution, it works very well, and I've seen them work, and it produces methane, which you can use for cooking in the kitchen, and there's no smell. That's not the problem. It's all good stuff. But maybe we should look at our building design. We've looked at that for water, haven't we? You've all got the fantastic, innovative invention that came out of the drought in Cape Town called the bucket in the shower. That's brilliant. Who would have thought? Yeah, wow. And we've still got the bucket in the shower. Okay, there's a better way. You can buy this little cheap clip at the top of my shower. It's got a little button. You press the button, the water goes out the hose pipe. The bucket's in the bath. And it's great, because all the water that you would have used waiting for it to get hot is now clean in the bucket. You can do whatever you like with it. But still the bucket's in the shower for the other water. We need to design our buildings to take electricity consumption and water consumption and reduce them. That is common sense. All right, what else? So this is a picture. I was going past the airport yesterday, and my daughter said to me, so what's that Cafe Verdi? Hotel Verdi. It's a green hotel at the airport that is absolutely magnificent. And it's a sign, or it's a demonstration of how we can build buildings by taking environmental considerations into account. So the carbon footprint of that building is virtually zero. Okay. All the electricity they use, they try and regenerate or recreate by absorbing carbon out of the atmosphere. And you should go. I've never actually been there, but I've read a lot about it. So that's something. Support people like that. Transport, reduce travel. I haven't flown anywhere this year. It's only the 14th. But I do a fair amount of flying. And it kills me, because flying is one of the worst pollutants. So when I'm sitting in economy class with my knees around my ears, and 400 other people around me, I kind of think, well, at least the plane's not empty. Of course, when I get an empty plane, you just think it's marvelous. But we need to think very seriously. Now, doing a road trip from here to Zanzibar is probably not more efficient than flying. But certainly, there are ways of reducing or making your travel more efficient. Fuel efficiency, definitely. And then alternatives. Okay, we hate to mention this public transport, but if we all went down to the bus station and supported the My City as often as we could, planned our life around it, it would not only reduce our emissions, it would also make the city sit up and say, whoa, people are using this. You know, we need to expand this. But we don't. Okay, I haven't been on a My City bus for at least 6 months. I'm very sad to say. So we should do that. Work from home is a very nice option. Don't feel guilty about telling your boss. Okay, none of you work anymore. Of course, some of you work. You all work. But you might be working for a boss. I'll be careful what I say now. But maybe working at home is a clever thing to do. Okay? If you think about the environmental cost that you're not expending, it might be a very clever thing to do. Now, that's your typical city. Okay? We build freeways because we have cars. That is not the most efficient way to build a city. Okay, now I'm not saying this can replace that, but if you have a public transport system that works, and you can create an environment, this is an old road, okay? This is in Malaysia. It's an old road. It used to look something like that, and they've now converted it into a park and a little river there. How much nicer is that? How does that add to your quality of life? There's a wonderful cartoon of these guys driving along a 16-lane highway in Los Angeles, driving there bumper to bumper, and the guy looks up to the hill and he sees these wind turbines and says, geez, that really spoils the view. That's the one in my neighborhood. That's really what we should be doing. And wouldn't that be nice? So I can't believe that we don't have creative minds here in Cape Town, in our universities, in our schools, in our public service, in our civil society, that cannot solve this train problem. Right, then you've all seen these ridiculously stupid and irritating light bulbs. They're either too bright, they're too yellow, they're too dim, they don't come on, and they look so ugly, and they don't fit in the lampshade, and they're just so ridiculous, and what do we do when we want to throw them away? And relax. You won't see these much anymore. We now have much fancier, nicer ones. Okay, you can get them in any shape and size, and whereas this was fluorescent, these are now LEDs. And they use a 60th of the power of the original Edison bulbs. So we should be using these. And they're not expensive. I think I took the slide out, but I had an advert from Game. Each one of these is about 29 Rand. Now you say 29 Rand, a normal light bulb is, have you been to buy a normal light bulb recently? 25 Rand? Okay, so get these, switch off, energy efficient appliances, etc. Now the last one, not the last one, but food. Now depending on where you are, where you come from, you will see one of two things on that slide. Okay, you will see the salad, or you will think, gee, a burger would be nice right now. Now I'm not blaming you, because they're equally attractive, they can be equally delicious, and the nutrition we can debate. But the point is, to get your burger, we need to grow these things. Annual per capita meat consumption rose from 11 to 29 in the last 35 years. Now we know that there are still many, many people who don't get enough protein. And my day job is to try and encourage alternative crops like legumes, which are high protein. Do you even know what a lentil is? Okay, you think, okay, it's the little brown things. When last did you eat a lentil if you're not a vegetarian? Maybe in some soup last winter, maybe. Do you know where lentils come from? Go down to Checkers, Pick n Pay, Woolworths. Go and look at the lentils. You get brown ones, you get yellow ones, you get red ones, you get black ones, you get green ones. You might even get pink ones with purple spots. But none of them are grown in South Africa. Brazil, Australia, China, the US, and other places. This is what happens when you grow cows. This is 1975 in Brazil. That's the start. 1986, when they start logging. Okay? Now they replace the fields with agriculture. So just look at that again. Okay, now this gets turned into, well, they burn it down as well. That's the annual deforestation. Okay, I missed the slide there. But there's a slide of animals grazing. So what they do is they then create pastures from that burnt down forest. There's still greenery, but they create pastures so they can grow cows. And those cows are all for the American market. So that's what happens. That's the result of eating meat. Now, somebody asked me before we started, let me just go back to the slide. So if we say eat less meat, what does that mean? So number one culprit is cows, beef. Okay, now, beef, cows are cute and all that. But if you saw where your beef comes from, it's not cute. These cows are standing in feedlots with, what's a nice way of saying it, excrement up to their elbows. And what are these things on cows? Knees, shins, whatever. Okay, and they have to be pumped with hormones, and they have to be kept away from all sorts of natural environments. And that's very, very sad. And the carbon emission from a cow is more than double that of a sheep. So, eat more lamb. Well, I shouldn't say eat more lamb, I should say eat more lamb instead of beef. Now, lamb's expensive, I understand that. So eat more pork. That's cheaper, and that's even less than a lamb. And if you really want to cut down on your emissions, go the chicken route. And if you really, really want to cut down on your emissions, you know what you have to do. Right, then we come to consumption and waste. How can consumption and waste contribute to climate change? Or contribution to emissions, reduce emissions? Well, this stuff has to go somewhere. Okay, it has to go somewhere. And generally it gets buried, and it also produces a lot of methane, and stuff goes into the soil and the water. And we've always said this, and this is the same old story: rethink, reduce, reuse, recycle, and I like to say pre-cycle. Before you buy something, think about how you're going to get rid of that thing. And then see if you can adjust your buying options in that way. All right, tomorrow we'll talk about how life goes on, how we're going to have to adapt to climate change. But there's quite a bit of time now, I think it's about 10, 15 minutes, for questions. And you did your homework yesterday, some of you, and I'm sure you've got some questions, and maybe we can discuss it amongst ourselves. So already we've got 1, 2 hands, 3 hands. So, yes, ma'am. What is clean coal? So clean coal is essentially an untruth. Untrue. There's no such thing as clean coal. So we can have, well, not perfectly clean coal. So you get coal, it's basically one of two things. It's either the carbon content of the actual block of coal, which can be as low as 40%, and can be up as high in anthracite, I think, is around 85%. So the more carbon there is in there, the more efficient it is, because the other stuff doesn't get released into the atmosphere when it's burnt, or as ash that comes out and has to be disposed of. But all coal is going to produce carbon dioxide. If there's 40% carbon in this piece of coal, that's going to produce 40% carbon dioxide, and so on. But you use less anthracite, but it's much more expensive. The other thing about clean coal is if you burn it efficiently, okay, then you reduce the amount of black carbon that goes into the sky. So when you see a diesel vehicle or a car driving along with lots of black smoke coming out, that is unburnt carbon. Okay, now it means it hasn't converted it into carbon dioxide, but in the conversion rate, it hasn't produced energy for the car to move, so essentially the guy's just pouring petrol out of his car in the forms of carbon, and that carbon soot is very, very bad for you and me to be breathing into. So clean coal is either the actual physical amount of carbon or the way that it is converted into energy. So the clean burning process. Yeah, the dirtier the coal is, the cheaper it is. But then you've got to work out at efficiency. So it's really supply and demand. So there's lots and lots and lots of dirty coal. So it's usually cheaper per amount of carbon. Whereas the purer one, I suppose like anything, the purer one is more expensive per gram of carbon. But the burning process is also quite tricky. But more and more companies are saying, well, let's try and burn it clean, because someone's measuring our emissions and our pollution. But essentially all coal is producing carbon dioxide. That's why we don't like the word clean coal. It's kind of putting a nice face onto a dirty, ugly technology. So,
I've got a friend who is a skeptic of climate change.
yes.
And as such, he sent me a video by a group called Global Warming Policy Foundation. And it was a talk by a guy called Matt Ridley. Apparently he's well known. He was commenting on your thing, was it RP 8.5?
RCP.
All of that is based on a thing called CMIP5.
CMIP.
And the problem is, he says, it's all not true because, 4 points. He said it assumes that the population growth is going to speed up. It assumes that the ocean will no longer be able to absorb CO2. It assumes that the income average person trebles, and it assumes that we are going to be using 10 times as much coal in the future as we are today.
Absolutely correct. Absolutely 100% correct. And the problem is, well, he's stating what we've already stated. RCIP 8.5 is a high growth scenario. In other words, no stops. Everyone wants to get aboard and get a good standard of living. So whereas some of those things are slightly false about the ocean's not going to absorb any carbon dioxide, what they're saying is we're going to take things to the extreme, and we're going to run a model with some of these extreme things. And yes, that is going to be very high. Okay? And that's probably unrealistic. Probably. Because we don't see governments turning around and saying, no, we don't want to be wealthy. Oh, please, wealthy? No, not for us. You know, we all want to have the fridge, the microwave, the TV, the car, etc. So that growth scenario might be very, very high, but it's not completely unfeasible. But there are some RCP 8.2, 8.6, I forget now. 8.5. It's not the one that we would use. We then use the others and we say, well, this is our current trajectory. Which one is it closest to? Oops. So most of my scenarios, those pictures, are definitely not RCP 8.5. They're the 5.6. They're the middle of the road. Okay, so those are the ones we use. So he's got a point. If you pick that one, it is unlikely. And hopefully we're never going to get there. Hopefully, because if we do, we're dead. You see, this is the sad thing. Now, I don't know this guy, but I know other skeptics, and it's so easy to point to something and say, well, that's just not true, pick a hole at that. But you've got to understand, we create these scenarios from very, very high situations to very, very low situations. This required by science, this thing I put up here, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think we're going to keep the temperature below 1.5, but that's what we want to do. 350.org is an international organization that said we have to go to 350 parts per million. Sorry, that boat sailed in 1984. We've gone with the 350. We're looking at 450 as a minimum now. So I hear what you're saying. I hear what he says. But I think we've got to look at the full picture.
One point.
Yes, sir.
Is this was a talk he gave in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
And one of his things that he said there is no sign that global warming is going to cause forest fires.
Going to cause forest fires. Global warming is not someone walking around with matches. But if extreme events... Yeah, well, if extreme events are going to lead to very, very hot days, you know what the temperature is in Oudtshoorn today? Okay, it's 42. It's nothing. I was there in the army. 42. No, I'm kidding. We didn't go around measuring then. But 42 is not pleasant. We're getting more and more of these extremely hot days. And there are going to be fires in Cape Town today. There are. And you might not notice it. This lady's got a question, but that lady was first. I'm coming to you. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
I drive through Mpumalanga quite often.
Yes.
And I see these huge power stations belching out black. Now, I have two questions. The one is that apparently one of South Africa's relatively large exports is so-called clean coal, and you pass several so-called cleaning or washing stations, which I assume use chemicals before they load the trucks to take them to the airport. My second question is, South African coal that's used in our power stations is obviously sub-grade, not exportable. Can one put filters or something else into these existing power stations to reduce the emissions?
So the first one about the clean coal is, yes, if our clean coal is so valuable, and we've got this is what the apartheid government designed the whole system around. We exported the cheap coal to get loads and loads of money. The cleaner coal, the anthracite. We exported that. And then we used the dirty coal ourselves. So that is a fact. That is happening. And we're still exporting a lot of coal. That's why Richards Bay was built, to export our coal. And we're still doing that. Yeah. So we're using a lot of the dirty coal, and that dirty coal is being focused on. So yes, you have to wash that coal because you've got to get the dust off it. Nobody wants to have piles of dust, and it's got to be clean. So they use a lot of water for that, which is iniquitous. Okay, but that's how the customer wants it. The customer wants it wrapped in plastic. The customer gets it wrapped in plastic. Remember? So if the customer wants washed coal, he gets washed coal. The second point was about filters. So what are we filtering out? So when we're burning, and you saw black smoke, remember that a power station, we had one at Athlone, those big cooling towers, the stuff pouring out the cooling towers. Now, how many of you live in Pinelands? Okay, you used to get this black stuff. That's not coming out of that cooling tower. That's just steam. That's harmless. It's those thin little towers that are producing the smoke, and some of that's invisible. So what they do is they let it out at night, the bad stuff. I had a lecturer who took videos of Milton refinery at night, and you can see these industries, they let all the bad stuff out at night when you can't see it. But that's what's producing the carbon dioxide and also the carbon soot if your coal is very, very dirty. So they've got what's called electrostatic filters. So they put an electric field across there. An electric field is a bit like, when you rubbed your hair with a ruler and you put it over these bits of paper and they all jumped up at school. Remember school? Remember that thing you used to go to? Okay, so you rub it. Okay, you haven't got hair anymore, so you rub it on your jersey. That's electrostatic. And these electrostatic filters then attract some of that carbon, but now that dust is there. And it falls down, has to be collected, has to be put in a pile, has to be disposed of. So some companies say, oh, to hell with that. But pollution restrictions control the amount of that you can emit. So these are very, very common, the electrostatic filters. So that is happening. Okay, you, ma'am.
A different matter, but 20 years ago, I was speaking to an Oxford professor, and he said the only way forward is litigation against global corporations and governments. Class action